In the shadow of the Great Pyramids of Giza, Egypt has displayed its latest archaeological discovery, tombs more than 4,000 years old, said to belong to workers who built them. The modest 9-foot deep shafts encased in limestone were uncovered last week. They held a dozen skeletons of pyramid builders, perfectly preserved by dry desert sand. In addition to bones, the tombs also contain jars that once held beer and bread meant for the workers in their afterlife. Egypt's archaeology chief Zahi Hawass said they date to the 4th dynasty, around 2,500 years before Christ. He said the discovery could well be the most important of the 21st century, with their location a key element in dispelling a popular belief.
But the discovery of the tombs of the pyramid builders reconstruct history and tell us that the builders of the pyramids were Egyptians and the builder of the pyramids were not slaves, because they will be buried beside the pyramids, in the shadow of the pyramids.
Hawass said the manner of their burial and the fact that those who died during the construction were entombed so close to the pharaohs and the pyramids meant they were honored workers, not slaves. Karen Sloan, The Associated Press.
Now what I want to do, since I only have a few minutes left, is run up and tell y'all about the man that y'all were taught to hate. You were all taught about this evil Pharaoh. Weren't you? Yes, sir. Who was it? Ramses, right? You were taught that he was an evil Pharaoh. You were taught that this man was an agent of the devil. You were taught that he enslaved the Hebrews and he wouldn't let them go, and God had to come and kill his firstborn and turn the Nile River into blood and bring frogs into Egypt and all that kind of. You were taught all that. That's right. That's right. You were taught about how many plagues? How many plagues was it? Was it 10 plagues? 7, 10, whatever. Look at somebody next to you and say, not one plague ever took place. Not one of them. The whole thing is a story made up by Jewish people to make the world think that they're God's chosen people. See, I think I said it a few weeks ago. I said it to you again. Everybody say this. He who controls the printed page controls the thinking of the age. Write that down. I wrote that. All right. So you can put that in a book somewhere. You can put Dr. Ray Hagen's. He who controls the printed page controls the thinking of the age. Here you have a group of imposters who came and created a lie and wrote themselves into history, and being that they had the first printing presses, they put it in a thing called the Gutenberg Bible. That was the first Bible printed, y'all, from the Gutenberg printing press. This story was made up about some Jews being held captive in Egypt by this great Pharaoh, and we were all taught that this man disobeyed God and God had to punish him, and God drowned his whole army. That's a lie. That never happened. Now, if you feel it's worth it, come on and go with me to Egypt so I can show you the evidence of what did happen, because it's still inscribed in stone. What did happen is the Hyksos, European invaders from the north, came in and invaded Egypt. And God raised up an African pharaoh named Amos. And Amos said, we need to take back our land. And Amos put an army together and drove these European invaders out of Egypt and drove them into the Noctis River or the Nile River, and they drowned. That's all in stone, man. All in stone right there in the temple of Ramses, in the Ramses temple. And the Europeans went in there and saw that and twisted the whole story.
before, we have to use visual documentation to bring this back for other brothers and sisters to see it, because they may not never make it back like you. But there were many invasions that came into Africa. When Normer, that we dealt with earlier, we talk about Normer when he reunited Upper and Lower Egypt, first defeating the Scorpion, bringing together the first world government. But it spoke of the Asiatic invasions. Even back during his time, Egypt faced many invasions that came in by way of the Delta. These were the Asiatics that you see right here. Now, as I mentioned before, the Asiatics who came across the Sinai. So here we see the earliest recording of these people who came in and settled with us for a while, till they built in numbers, and then eventually attacking Egypt. This is again from Khnumhotep's tomb from the 12th dynastic period, right during the time of Amenhotep III. Here again, Manetho talks about, now you can see the Hyksos who came into Egypt, and Manetho said, unexpectedly from the region of the east came men of unknown race, confident of the victory, they marched against our land. By force they took it easy without a single battle. Having overpowered our rulers, they burned our cities without compassion and destroyed the temples. All the people were treated with great cruelty, for they slew some and carried off the wives and children of others into slavery. Doesn't that sound like a familiar account? This period is documented around 1650 or 1750, right around the same time of Abraham. Now, take a good look of the pictures that I showed earlier too. These were the Hyksos that you see right here. These were the invaders, just as you see them carved in stone right here. These are the people who came out of the Sinai. Some say from Mycenae, some say they were Hurrians. These are the Temerians who were indigenous to the Nile Valley, as well as the Ta-Nehisian brothers who were further up in the southern part of Egypt, or Kemet, ancient Ethiopia as some would call it. These were the Tamahu people who invaded from Libya from the west. They attacked Egypt after the 6th dynastic period. Now, it was this brother that we showed again, Thutmose I, who finally expelled them out of our land. Now, I'm showing this in reference with the temple, how our ancestors, you're witnessing, recording these people who came into our land, who invaded until Thutmose I finally expelled them. We want to give you documented evidence to show you that we were at war with these people who invaded our land. We did not have anyone enslaved, but in fact the Hyksos enslaved us for 200 years. If we deal with the 21st dynasty, 22nd dynasty, 23rd dynasty, these were all Asiatic. Shishak, that Badawi will show us in a little while, he was also of Asiatic origin. So again, indigenous African Kemetic people were not even on the throne then. This is why this is so important to understand this in the Bible, because by looking at the Bible in America and the Western world, they look at this as all being part of Egypt, not saying that we were enslaved ourselves by these Asiatic people. And the same people who are ruling us today, who are exploiting us out of our minds, are the same people who invaded our land long ago, who came in even during the time of the 12th dynastic period, right after Amenhotep. And we called them the troglodytes who came out of the desert. How can we dispute this documented evidence, documented information? But the only way we're going to get this story right, we're going to have to start writing our own holy text, because if everybody else have had their story and revised the Bible, then why can't we, the original writers of the book, bring it back to its African origin? Now right here on these temples here, now you can see documented where we tied them up, roped them, and forced them out of our land. These are the people that we've always had problems with. The problem is we don't understand a historical war. It's a historical war with these people. And European Ashkenazi European Jews know this. We're the people who don't know it. It's an ancient historical war from the time we've had contact with them. So we're coming back here and hearing the words of our ancestors and those who knew what happened in that day, and that's why they had to turn the story against African people. So you're coming back for an eyewitness account, not for spiritual enslavement, but for spiritual freedom, for the emancipation of our souls, for the resurrection of African people.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
For many years, brothers and sisters returned back with us on the Kemetyu Know Thyself educational tour to see an eyewitness account what our ancestors wrote for us on the temples and tombs, which are books in stone, that now end up in many of the biblical stories today. Let's continue with the live lecture.
These are the people who enslaved our people. These people set up in an area of Kemet and Lower Kemet called Avaris, took over, and were enslaving the Africans for over 200 years until Second Enrei of the 17th dynasty, and it is he who waged war on the battlefield, and his life was lost on the battlefield, and it was his son Thutmose who continued the battle until his son Utmost, who opened up the 18th dynasty. This is a real person, brothers and sisters, who said never again. He was the liberator, the emancipator, who kicked these Hyksos out of our land. This is the real historical account that we've got to start teaching our people, brothers and sisters. So they took from this African right here his name Utmost and made a Moses. This is the only account that we expelled a large group of people out of our land, this African right here, who opened up the 18th dynasty known as the Golden Age. This is the historical account, brothers and sisters. In fact, let's go into another warrior soldier, as we see in his name, Menkaperah, Djehuti Mays. He had 17 battles and won them all. He also wanted to make sure that these Hyksos were not going to come into our land. Here you see Menkaperah's battle, showing where he's battling the Hyksos. Look at some of them hiding behind trees as cowards right here. This is the story that our ancestors left us in stone, as though they knew that one day we would forget our story. Here's the battle of Menkaperah, who battled and wanted to make sure these Hyksos were not going to come into our land. In fact, this brother, he made sure that he even educated these people he was conquering into the Kemetic history, okay, initiated them into make sure that they will keep control of people that they're conquering. So that brother was brilliant. In fact, he put a whooping on a city so bad called Megiddo. Do you know this is where the name Armageddon came from, Megiddo right here? That's where the origin of that name came from.
Of history, we will go to Manetho, a native Egyptian historian who lived during the 3rd century BCE. And he wrote a book about the history of his own country, Egypt, known as Egyptica. And in Egyptica, Manetho states, in quotes, Timaeus, in his reign, for what cause I know not, a blast of God smote us, and unexpectedly from the regions of the east, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force, they easily overpowered the rulers of the land. They then burnt our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with a cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others.
Then they made one of their own king. His name was Salatis. These 6 were their first kings. They all along waged war against the Egyptians and wanted to destroy them to the very roots. These people, whom we have called kings before, and shepherds too, and their descendants, as he says, held Egypt for 511 years. Then he says, the kings of Thebes and other parts of Egypt rose against the shepherds, and a long and terrible war was fought between them. He says further, by a king named Alisrag-Mudosis, the shepherds were subdued and were driven out of the most parts of Egypt and shut up in a place named Avaris. Thutmose, son of Alisrag-Mudosis, attempted to take the city by force and by siege, with 480,000 men surrounding it. But he despaired of taking the place by siege and concluded a treaty with them that they should leave Egypt and go without any harm coming to them, wherever they wished. After the conclusion of the treaty, they left with their families and chattels, not fewer than 240,000 people, and crossed the desert into Syria. This whole nation was styled Hyksos, that is, shepherd kings, for the first syllable Hyk, according to the sacred dialect, denotes a king, as is Sos, a shepherd. According to the passage we just read, Manetho states, an obscure race of invaders from Asia in the east, known as shepherds, came into Egypt, conquered Egypt, destroyed the cities and temples in Egypt, killed and massacred the native Egyptians, enslaved the women and children, and wanted to destroy the Egyptians to the very roots. But later on, a brave and noble family of black native Egyptian kings in southern Egypt, being fed up with the oppression of their people, decided to stir up a revolt, and thus united the forces, attacked the shepherds, defeated the shepherds, expelled the shepherds out of Egypt, and therefore freed their people from the yoke of slavery. And this is according to Manetho. And concerning those two brave warrior kings mentioned in the writings of Manetho as Alisrag Mythosis and Thutmosis, are known in the sacred writings of Kemet as King Kamos and Amos of the 17th dynasty. And fortunately, we have surviving primary records in their own writings mentioning their victory against the shepherds. And here in the stele of Kamos of the 17th dynasty, he says in quote, "I will sail north to engage the Asiatics, and success will come. The enduring king Waje Kepura, son of Ra, Kamos the mighty, given life, who subdued the south and drove back the north, who seized the land by main force."
So there it is. When the source is brought forth, the truth comes out. And when the source is present, the truth cannot be denied. And truth is, the other side of the story has spoken. And according to history, the Egyptians, the Africans, were not the villains and slave masters as the Bible portrayed them as. But truth is, the Egyptians were actually the slaves being oppressed by these people called shepherds, known in the Bible as the children of Israel, the people of the book. Now, doesn't this sound familiar? Like once upon a time when the Christian Bible followers of the Abrahamic faith enslaved Africans right here in America under the laws of the Bible, the same Bible that says, obey your slave master, the same Bible that cursed the Africans in their first book called Genesis, and the same Bible that changed the story and demonized Africans as slave masters in their book called Exodus. But thanks to history, we now know the truth, and the truth shall set us free.
Exodus. As I told you before, I will go over Exodus and conquest stories briefly, just to demonstrate that the same rules that I have described can be applied to these narratives as well. This treatment of the patriarchal stories can serve as a model for the reading of Exodus. In this case, too, the attempts to locate the events in the 13th century BC in the time of Pharaoh Ramses II have faced insurmountable difficulties. There is no mention of such an event in any New Kingdom source. There is no trace of the early Hebrews in Egypt. The northern coast of Sinai was protected by formidable Egyptian forts, which could have easily prevented an escaping people from crossing the desert. There is no trace of late bronze remains in the rest of the Sinai Peninsula, not even in a place like Kadesh Barnea, where the Israelites are supposed to have camped for a long time. And Canaan of that time was an Egyptian province administered by Egyptian garrisons, where 50 Egyptian soldiers were enough to pacify an area according to the Amarna letters. Finally, many of the places mentioned in the story of Exodus and the wandering in the desert were not inhabited before the 8th or even 7th centuries BC. Indeed, the Egyptologist Donald Redford convincingly showed that both the geography of Exodus in the Eastern Delta and the personal names in the story best fit the site period in the history of Egypt in the 7th and 6th centuries BC. That is close to the time of the compilation of the biblical text. A late date compilation would also fit most of the place names mentioned in regard to the wandering in the desert. At the same time, Redford did not discard the possibility that Exodus preserves an ancient memory of great events which took place centuries earlier, possibly the expulsion of Canaanite population from the delta of the Nile in the 16th century BC. Is it possible that the story of great confrontation between the Israelites and an Egyptian pharaoh was used to send a strong message to the Judahites of late monarchic times? Sum up. The patriarchs' Exodus and conquest narratives, which describe the formative history of the people of Israel, cannot be read as a straightforward historical account. It is conceivable that many of the stories preserve old memories, folk tales, myths, and archaeological anecdotes. But in the way they are portrayed in the Bible, they are wrapped in late monarchic, and in the case of the patriarchs and Exodus, also post-exilic realities. Moreover, the way in which they were compiled discloses that they serve the ideological aims of the authors. These stories should not be read, therefore, in a sequential order from early to late. Rather, as I mentioned yesterday, they must be understood from late to early, from the perspective of the period when they were put in writing.
Testament is historical fiction. You will find some history in it. You will find some places that actually do exist. But that doesn't mean that the story itself is actually a true historical story. I used to be an ordained minister, as you heard. No archaeological evidence for any of the stories that we find in the Old Testament. 2, there is no literary evidence for any of the stories that we find in the Old Testament. 3, the literary evidence itself shows parallels with ancient mythology. The stories that we find in the Old Testament are cut from the same fabric of other ancient mythologies. 4, there are many historical anachronisms in the Old Testament, things which simply cannot be true. They are mistakes that the authors made. If anyone should care about this foundational myth, the Jews themselves and the Israelis should care. But did you know that almost all rabbis will tell you the stories of the Old Testament are allegorical? They were not historical. In the Jewish temple in Madison, Wisconsin, where I played the piano once for a wedding, I look at the Torah, and right in the preface it says, these stories are not to be taken literally. These are just stories. They're like legends, right? The Jews themselves treat these stories as legends, as myths. The Israelis over in Israel, if anyone would care about the foundational story of the nation of Israel, the Israeli scholars themselves should. And yet the archaeologists over there are throwing up their hands saying, nope, there's nothing. None of these stories has any archaeological evidence at all. Israel Finkelstein, for example, who teaches there in Israel, they had access to the Sinai Peninsula. They were able to look and see, was there a group of 2 or 3 million people wandering in that peninsula for 40 years with all their cattle and all their tents? No, there was not. The Israeli archaeologists and historians themselves agree that the story is mythological. It did not happen.
A subset of black people are reluctant to identify with Kemet, otherwise known as Egypt, because many blacks have come to associate themselves with the Israelites who were liberated from Egypt in the biblical Exodus story. However, according to the archaeological and historical record, this narrative is mythological and not historical. In other words, biblical archaeologists haven't found any strong evidence for such an occurrence. According to Gary Greenberg, the president of the Biblical Archaeology Society of New York, much of the biblical stories are mythological and not historical. He wrote a book titled 101 Myths of the Bible, How Ancient Scribes Invented Biblical History, and he provides ample evidence for this claim in that text. Similarly, an Egyptologist named Mustafa Budala does the same in his text titled The Ancient Egyptian Roots of Christianity. Budala details how many of the Judeo-Christian narratives of the Bible are rescripts of an ancient Kemetic, otherwise known as Egyptian, history and mythology. As a point of clarification, mythology doesn't necessarily mean untrue, but mythology is imbued with psychological and theological truths that are distinct from historical or literal truths. This is also why an Oxford-trained theologian and former Anglican priest, but still a Christian, Harpur, states that, quote, In the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the Christian church made a fatal and fateful error, either deliberately in a competitive bid to win over the greatest numbers of the largely unlettered masses, or through willful ignorance of the true inner sense of the profound spiritual wisdom it had inherited from so many ancient sources. The church took a literalist, popularized historical approach to sublime truth. What was preserved in the Amber allegory, it misrepresented as plotting fact. End quote.